Today's shir is about Hanukkah and so on. I'm going to try and explain the essence of Hanukkah. But the truth of the matter is, to really understand Hanukkah, you really have to understand the context of Hanukkah. What do I mean by context? Hanukkah is an event which occurred at some period in human history. And in order to understand the event of Hanukkah, it's really necessary to understand what the event of Hanukkah, how it occurred and why it occurred and when it occurred in human history. So therefore, to understand Hanukkah, we're going to have to go back a little bit and really explain what's going on so that the event of Hanukkah became necessary. And then we'll have a much clearer understanding of what actually happened on Hanukkah and what we are celebrating, really, and so on. First of all, we're not celebrating a memory of an event. We're not commemorating some event that happened many years ago. Because Lutzato says, the Ramchal says, that all the Yom Tovim that we celebrate have nothing to do with memories of the event itself, a commemoration of the event. But all of them have to do with really re-energizing the same event that happened a long time ago so that it can occur now. In other words, when we celebrate Hanukkah in a certain way, the same energy that came down to the earth at that time, which was related to the event of Hanukkah, is now coming down again. And because it's coming down now again, we can therefore benefit from the energy again a second time. So therefore, every holiday in the Jewish calendar is a repetition of the energy that once came down at that time. So what was the energy that came down at that time, and what does it relate to? Well, to understand what Hanukkah is, it's connected to a certain idea that I've really never discussed before, and so on. It's the idea of the concept of what the goal is. A person is composed of something ruchni, spiritual, and gashmi, something physical. Therefore, he's composed of a guf and a shama. The guf is the body, is gashmi, is physical, and the neshama of the person is ruchni, is spiritual. And the two combine together to create the concept of an Adam, of a Zulasoi, and so on. But the actual goal is that in order for a person to reach his shlemus, or his highest level, in some way these two entities, a Gashmi, a physical entity, and a spiritual entity, have to in some way merge, and so on. And what they merge is to the experience of Chokhmah, which is one dimension of what a person is, and the spirit of Ruchnius, or spirituality, which is an experiential concept. And the two together, when they're combined and they merge together, they represent a term which is very rarely used, but it's a critical term used in Hashkafa. And the term that's used is Haskala, the concept of understanding. And we have to understand what exactly is Haskala. Haskala represents the shlemus, or the perfection of a human being, into its ultimate category. The human being has to understand, has to relate to two aspects of his personality. One aspect of his personality is ruchni, his spirituality. And the other aspect of his being is gashmius, is to chokhmah, to understanding the basic relationship between cause and effect, the mechanics of ruchnius and the mechanics of gashmius. The ruchnius of the man is essentially when a person is consciously, when his conscious mind is connected to his neshama and is connected to his spirituality. The consciousness of a person, therefore, the self-awareness of a person, therefore experience his awareness in spiritual terms. The gashmis of a person represents that which is hidden. It signifies the Yetzer Hara, the impulses of the physical, and therefore it signifies a direction which believes in fundamentally the multiplicity of entities. The world of physicality signifies the multiplicity of entities. There are many entities in the world. There are millions of entities in the world. Each entity is a being. It has an essence and has existence. But there are many of them. Each different thing represents a different essence, a different definition. And therefore, there are an independent relationship between all entities, humans and animals and plants and inanimate objects. There are millions of entities that signify the world of Gashmias, but all of them are totally separate, and so on. We do not clearly see the relationship of entities in the physical world. But then there's the world of Ruchnius, the world of spirituality. In this world, all entities are connected together as an organism, and they all are related to each other in a certain way. And when we experience this relationship directly, we no longer see them as a multiplicity. We see them as a singular universe, a universe composed of all things which are connected together as an organism. Therefore, all of them relate to the fundamental purpose of man. That's to achieve a certain dveikus with the Rebbeinu Shalom without having his self-awareness interfering with the aspect of God as a unified being. We understand the problem of Namlik Sufa. Namlik Sufa is a problem that when a person is self-aware, is aware of God, he sees God as with the pronoun you. So he sees me and you. But this is a mistake. God is not you. He's not a you. God is the person. He is the person himself. God says to the human being, I am you. But he says, you are not me. You have self-awareness, and therefore you consider yourself separate from me. That's really not true. I am you, and I am the energy, and the energy that gives you your self-awareness itself. So therefore, when you refer to me as you, you're making a mistake. And therefore, I want you to understand it, because this mistake that you're making creates a certain disempowerment when you are disconnected from me in that regard, because you see me as outside of you. And this disempowerment we have to remove, because with disempowerment you cannot truly enjoy the future world, which is the world of God and the world of divine being. So you have to therefore remove this problem, which is called Namlik Sufa, which is a fundamental disempowerment which you share. And how do you remove that? Because you can't remove your sense of self-awareness, because your sense of self-awareness is you. So how do you remove that? You remove that by loving me, by developing a relationship of love. And when you develop a relationship of true love to my being, then we are connected. We are like one being together, because love does that to a person. It makes a person feel like he is part of the person or the object or the being that he loves. And therefore, the problem of Namlik Sufa, which is a separation of us both, is cancelled. And we feel like we are part of one being, which is me. So therefore, God placed man on the world to resolve this problem, to give him the ability to love him. And he does this by giving him mitzvahs, by giving him commandments, especially the commandment to love God. Mankind achieves this unity, this achdus with God. So therefore, what a human being has the power is to experience this ruchnius, this spirituality. And when he experiences this ruchnius, he experiences in a certain sense the place where the world of God, not really, because God is beyond spirit, but in a certain sense he experiences God and him as an organism together, as a single being. And that's the total experience of ruchnius. But he also experiences his soul in a body. And in that experience, he sees himself as separate from God and as an entity outside of God, and God is outside of him. And this is a mistake. The concept is to join these two forces. Now, and create a certain self-awareness, which is called Haskala. And therefore, I'm going to talk about this concept of Haskala, because Haskala is the merger between a feeling, the experience of Ruchnius, and the experience of Chokhmah. So I want to define what this experience of Ruchnis is and the experience of a Chokhmah, or wisdom. What exactly does God want from us? He wants us to experience spirituality, to experience the world where all entities are united as one organism. But he also wants us to understand this concept by Chokhmah, by an understanding, by a certain wisdom. So he wants us to understand the cause and effect relationships behind the mechanism of spirituality and physicality. In other words, what's the mechanism that governs the laws of spirituality and the laws of physicality and the laws of the way they will unify? Because the ultimate goal is where the soul will suddenly spiritualize the body and they will become one organism. That's right. In other words, Chokhmah will combine with the experience of Ruchnius, and suddenly the world of Gashmis, or physicality, will disappear. With a certain level of Chokhmah, by understanding of the mechanisms of Gashmis and the mechanisms of Ruchnius, mankind will merge the two entities, the two substances, and they will become one. And this merger is called Haskala. And this is the ultimate goal of the Zulasai. Now, when Adam Harishon was first created, he was a spiritual being. He didn't experience spirituality as outside of him. He experienced both his physicality and his spirituality as one separate entity, but they were divided. He had a body, and from his body he felt physical, but he had a soul, and from his soul he felt spiritual. And the experience of both was direct. It was intrinsic to him. He felt that he was a spiritual being, and he felt that he was a physical being. He felt both of them as a dichotomy, as an ambivalence, but he felt them both as an intrinsic piece of him. Therefore, his feeling of the spirit towards the soul was direct. It was not extrinsic to him. It was not outside of him. It was a direct experience of the neshama. He could feel the neshama directly. That's right. He could feel his neshama directly expressing itself to him in the sense that everything is one and God is part of him. God is him, and so on. And he can feel his body also as separate, as part of him, as a separate concept and a separate sense of self-awareness. So that both of them were intrinsic feelings. And therefore, what should have been done after he should have completed the mitzvah which God gave him, which is not to eat from the Eitz Das Tova, then automatically what should have happened is that his soul would have purified his body and spiritualized it so that the body would lose its substance, it would lose its darkness, it would lose the interference that it casts between spirituality and physicality. Because physical and spiritual would unite in him as one substance, and he would become totally spiritual on a much higher level. He would reach a madreg of Haskala, of true understanding, but not only understanding of the mechanics of all things and the cause and effect relationships between all things with Chokhmah. He would also understand the experience of spirituality in its true sense, and he would understand the way he exists in a total way as a term of Haskala. But after the sin, because of the sin of Adam Harishon, he never reached that later. He never reached that madrega. Because his physical aspect and his spiritual aspect suddenly separated. And they separated, even though they separated and they became two circles that just touch each other. They do not intersect with each other. The circle of physicality and the circle of spirituality before the sin of Adam were two intersecting circles, one circle going into another. And that intersection was the part of him that he felt a union between the physical and spiritual, in the sense that he felt both of them. But after the sin, suddenly God decreed death. God decreed that his physical existence and his spiritual existence would now separate. Even though the two are still connected and they have contact with each other, so that the two circles which represent the physical and the spiritual, they don't intersect anymore, but they touch each other at their circumference. So therefore, the spiritual does fortify the physical, but they no longer intersect. So therefore, he could not feel the spiritual or the physical sense. What truly alone, truly together, he can only feel these alone. And therefore, finally, he would die, which means that the physical would separate from the spiritual, and then the spiritual will go to Gan Eden, will go to a spiritual place called Gan Eden. And then finally, at the end of time, the spiritual aspect of him and the physical aspect would reemerge, would again unify. This is called Zichor Haguf, and this is the ultimate purpose of a man. Now, what was the Madreg of Adam Rishon before the sin? What do I mean when I say Adam Rishon before the sin was completely spiritual and physical, but he was on a much higher level than us? How do we know this? We know this because he lived in a place called Gan Eden. He lived in what's called the Garden of Eden. That's where Adam Rishon was before the sin. And what was the Garden of Eden? What does that mean, Gan Eden? What is Gan Eden to us? Well, Gan Eden to us is the place when the neshamas go after they die. When the neshama leaves the body and the person dies, we say that the neshama of the person, the soul of the person, goes to a place called Gan Eden, which means that according to us, the way we see it, Gan Eden is a totally spiritual place, which is the residence of the neshama. The physical place is the residence on earth, and the two are separated at death. But how could we call the spiritual place Gan Eden? I mean, how could we call the spiritual place Gan Eden when Adam Rishon lived in Gan Eden before the sin? Because before the sin of Adam Rishon, he was what? He was physical and spiritual, which means that Gan Eden was a spiritual place. It was also a physical place. So therefore, we see a tremendous chiddush from this. We see the true madreg of Adam Rishon before the sin, that Adam Rishon was both spiritual and physical at the same time. And this was the original status of Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden. It was only, therefore, it was only after the sin that Gan Eden separated from the physical universe, and Gan Eden became the residence of souls, not of bodies. So therefore, we see what? We see that Adam Rishon was able to see it was in the madreg of Gan Eden before the sin. That means that the madreg, in order to reach the madreg of Gan Eden before the sin, in which Adam Rishon resided at, we would have to actually die. That's right. In other words, the human being dies and then he goes to Gan Eden. But Adam Rishon lived in Gan Eden as a physical being composed of both a soul and a body. So therefore, we see that he was in a much higher level than us. He was much more spiritual. You see it. And therefore, the madrega of Gan Eden now is completely spiritual, whereas before it was both physical and spiritual. So Adam Rishon on that level was much higher than he was after the sin, and he could see things spiritually that we can no longer see at all. Now, Adam Rishon before the sin had tremendous chokhmah. We see that he had tremendous wisdom. How do we see that? Because God said to him, I want you to name all the animals and all the beings on the earth, and so on. So he said to Adam Rishon, I want you to name everything. So, for example, he started to name all the animals. And what was the name he gave to the animals? For example, he saw a horse, and he said to this horse, your name shall be Sus in Hebrew. Samach, Vav, Samach. That's the name of a horse. But on what basis that Adam Rishon named all the animals? Because Adam Rishon had tremendous wisdom. He looked at the horse and he was able to see the essence of a horse. What exactly were the spiritual powers that created the horse? And the spiritual powers which created a horse are the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So he understood that the horse was created from three letters: Samach, the letter Samach, the letter Vav, and the letter Samach. And the combination of these three letters into a word called Sus represents the spiritual creation of a horse itself. It represents the creative powers which created the horse. And in such a fashion, Adam Rishon was able to name all the animals on earth, and so on, and the plants and so on and so forth. Because Adam Rishon was able to see the spiritual essence and the spiritual energy which was involved in Maisa Bereshis and actually creating it. So therefore we see that Adam Rishon was a tremendous chacham. We do not have this wisdom anymore at all. So therefore, Adam Rishon was supposed to take this chachma and combine it with the spiritual aspect and do the mitzvah. And by doing the mitzvah, he would rise to a new level that has never been reached by man. And that level is called Haskala, the understanding of the mechanisms and the cause and effect relations of all physicality and all spirituality together as a unit. This was the madrega that Adam would reach. And once he began to understand this totally, you see it, this level was called the 50th gate. It's called the 50th gate, and it's the highest level of Torah. This would give him a total understanding of the Chokhmah and the Ruchnius that was required. And then he would begin to rise up and elevate himself slowly with this Chokhmah and eventually acquire the madrega of Olam Haba, of the future world. Once a person reaches the level of Haskala, where he completely understands the relationship of physicality and spirituality, and he understands the unity of both, and he's able to experience that unity, this is the beginning of Olam Haba. But after the sin, he could not do this anymore. He lost all this chokhmah and so on and so forth. But what happened to Adam Rishon after the sin, and what happened to mankind? Well, the main thing that happened to mankind was the event called death, where physicality and spirituality were separated. No longer were they connected. So therefore, the body resides on the earth with the soul in it, and then after death, the soul leaves the body and goes up to the spiritual world and goes into a place called Gan Eden. But Adam Rishon could not inhabit both worlds at the same time, which he was able to before the sin. Ruchnius, spirituality, was separated from Gashmius. So therefore, Adam Rishon was able to obtain Chokhmah to some extent, but he was never able again to obtain the Chokhmah that he could have acquired before, which is the Chokhmah of the Nun Sharei Bina, the 50th gate of wisdom, which is the highest level of Chokhmah at that time. But he was able to, in a certain sense, have a connection to Ruchnius, not directly. In other words, even though he had a soul and could experience a certain ruchnius in him, but that ruchnius that he experienced was from far away. It's like looking at a certain place from a distance. He can only see spirituality from a very far away, because ruchnius was no longer connected to Gashmius. And the ability of Adam Rishon to look in ruchnius from far away was called nevuah. What exactly is nevuah, or called prophecy? What exactly is prophecy? Prophecy is the ability of a person to somewhat separate from his physicality. He suddenly can go into a trance or goes into a state of consciousness where he can actually see in his imagination. He can see the world of Ruchnius in an imagination form, in the form of physicality, but he can see the truths of spirituality in physical form. And this is called prophecy. Most of the time, a prophet had to go into a trance. He had to fall into a deep sleep, a deep trance, near death. And suddenly he would be in a position where he would be like in the world of Ruchnius. And he could see many spiritual truths that were far beyond the ability to see physical truths. In other words, even though Adam Rishon lost the ability to be intrinsically involved with spirituality, he can still visit the spiritual world. That's right. He can visit temporarily the spiritual world and somehow see the truths and the existence of a spiritual world through prophecy. So therefore, what was given to him was the concept of visitation of spirituality, no longer residence of spirituality. Before the sin, Adam Rishon resided in the spiritual world as much as he resided in the physical world through his soul and his body. But after the sin, Adam Rishon was able to visit the spiritual world by being a prophet, by engaging in the process of prophecy. He was able to see certain truths about spirituality in the form of physicality. He was able to, in a certain sense, we say, visit the spiritual world. So the complete involvement of Adam Rishon with the spiritual world was not confiscated. Adam Rishon, therefore, Nevuah, but we see that before the sin of Adam Rishon, there was no such thing as Nevuah. There was no such thing as prophecy, because Adam Rishon was not involved in visiting the spiritual world. He was involved in intrinsically being in this spiritual world. He can actually feel his neshama in his guf. But after the sin, he could no longer feel his neshama, because the neshama now resided fundamentally in his body, and his neshama now connected to a world which is separated from his body. But he could still contact that world through nevuah, through prophecy. Now the people who lived after him, from the time of the Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood, and the people in the Dor HaMabul, the people who lived in the generation of the tower to rebel against God, and the Ovis and the patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, all of these souls, before Matan Torah, before God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, were very high souls. They were incredible souls, and so on before. And therefore, they were called shrushim. They were called root souls. Why? Because anything that they did in terms of themselves, any mitzvah that they did, not only affected them, but it also affected their toldus, their children. These people were so great, they were so powerfully spiritual, that they were, when they would do mitzvahs or sins, they were able to actually affect the spiritual status of their children. That's right. Today, this is no longer true. Only in those generations of the generation of the flood, 10 generations after Adam, and 10 generations after that by the Dor HaFlogah, the generation of the Babylon, of the Tower of Babel, that they rebelled against God, and the Ovis. All of these people were very high souls, and therefore they were deeply connected with the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah at that time, which is the presence of God, was essentially in these people. Even though they did not have the 10 commandments, the 630 commandments, the Taryag mitzvahs, they still had a certain relationship, where the relationship with the Shekhinah was inside their consciousness. That's why they never needed a Beis HaMikdash, and they never needed any of these things, because fundamentally their connection to spirituality was much higher than it is now. So they had a direct relationship with the Shekhinah. They did not have to relate to the Shekhinah through some kind of artificial means or some kind of indirect way. How do we know this to be true? How do we know that these people from the Dor HaMabul and the Dor HaFlogah and the Ovis, well, we know that they were shrushim. We know that which they did affected their children. Like it says, Maisa Ovis Siman Labanim. You see, that which happened to the patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, also repeated itself to that which happened to their children. So therefore we see that the deeds of these people were so great, in the sense that it affected them in such a powerful way, that their children, the nature of their children, which actually affected by the status in which they existed. That's why they were called shrushim. And how do we know that they were so big and so great? Because we see that God killed the first 10 generations. The first 10 generations of man was killed through a flood. Now we ask the question, well, why did that generation have to die from a flood? If God wanted to kill the people, he could have killed them by natural means, by earthquakes or volcanic eruptions or by a plague. Instead, God chose to kill all mankind through a flood, by in immersing the entire world in water. But what was that emergence? Well, in order to create a flood, the flood had to reach higher than the mountains. You know, it says that the flood was as high as Mount Ararat, which means that in order to flood the planet Earth through water as high as the mountains, that means the entire Earth was covered with water. Well, this is impossible. Even when it rains, it doesn't cover the earth with water. The water only goes up to the oceans and a little further than that. But it does not flood the entire planet. That's an impossibility. That's a nace. But we see that was required for God to kill the people who lived at the time of the flood. So the question is, how could God do that? Why did he have to kill them with a flood, which is actually miraculous? So the answer is that was flood that killed them was actually a symbol of something else. Because it says that that in the time of the Mashiach, the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of God, like the waters cover the sea. So therefore we see that the physical symbol of the messianic light, the highest light of all, the Nun Sharabina, is water. Water is the metaphor that symbolizes the Nun Sharabina, the 50th gate. So therefore God did not kill the world with just water. It was a mabul, it was a flood, but it was not real water in the usual sense. It was the symbol of the messianic light. God converted the messianic light to water, and that light was supposed to fill the entire planet, because the messianic light is supposed to fill the entire planet Earth. So therefore, the water which symbolized the messianic light now filled the entire world. So therefore, God destroyed the 10 generations after Adam Rishon with a flood, which really, he destroyed the world through the messianic light. What that means that the people at that time were so powerful and they were so high that their purpose was actually to bring the messianic light. That's right. The first 10 at the end of the first 10 generations, the Mashiach was supposed to come. And when he was supposed to come, he was supposed to bring down the Nun Sharabeh, the 50th gate, and bring mankind to the level of Haskala, where suddenly Chokhmah combines with spirituality and raises man to the highest level. That's that was the actual purpose of the first 10 generations. But since they sinned grievously to God, God converted the messianic water, therefore killed them all with a flood. But that shows you how high they were. They were so high that they themselves, the 10 generations after Adam, were so great that they were supposed to bring the Mashiach and the messianic light. That's right. Because they were shvashim. And God punished them with the physical equivalent of the messianic light. That shows you how powerful they were. And not only that, the Dor HaFlug was also very powerful. It was also extremely powerful and so on. And the Avos, the patriarchs, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who were part of the Dor HaFlug, they were actually the last people in the Dor HaFlug. Avram Avinu was really the Mashiach of the Dor HaFlug, just like Noach was really the Mashiach of the Dor HaMabul. So they belong to these generations. And like I said before, the souls of these generations had a direct contact with the Shekhinah. They had a direct contact with spirituality. They had many prophets and so on and so forth. And there were many great men at that time. But the generation as a totality, as a whole, committed a great many sins. But these people were shvashim. They were root souls, that whatever they did to mitzvahs and to sins affected all their children as well, and they therefore could affect the spiritual status of the generations that came from them for the rest of time. So these were not normal human beings as we think of them. They were shvashim, or root souls, that had direct connection to the Shekhinah, and in certain ways had a direct connection to spirituality. Spirituality was much more of a natural phenomenon to them than it is to us. We today are much further in spirituality than they were, and I want to speak about that later. Now, the next time that mankind became finally spiritual again was by Matan Torah. Because Matan Torah, with Moshe Rabbeinu and Klal Yisrael, the Jews left Egypt and they did tshuva for all the sins of Avodah Zarah in Egypt, and they left Egypt and they went to Har Sinai. At Har Sinai they were supposed to receive the Torah. But exactly what do we mean by the first luchos, the first tablets of the Torah that they were supposed to receive on Shavuos? Well, what they were supposed to receive is not simply the Torah, but the Torah in the form of Haskala, in the madrega of the Nun, of the 50th gate. The Torah is composed of 50 gates of wisdom. The highest of all these gates is the 50th gate, which is the messianic light itself. Once a person reaches the 50th gate, he achieves the level of the merger of physicality and spirituality. Suddenly it's called scholar, understanding, the level of understanding which is possible for the human being, and from that level he can go to Olam Haba. So Matan Torah was supposed to be the Messianic Geula, was supposed to be the redemption, and Moshe Rabbeinu himself was supposed to be the Mashiach. But what happened? The Jews worshipped the golden calf. And I'm not going to explain the whole Indian of the golden calf, but because they worshipped the golden calf, they lost that possibility of the Torah coming down to the world, the Ten Commandments and the Torah coming down to the world at that time through Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. They lost the possibility of that revelation being at the 50th level, which is the level of what Adam region also should achieve. So just like Adam failed to bring the 50th level down and reach the level of a Haskala, so also the Jews who came to the Matan Torah at that time also lost that level because of the sins of the golden calf. Not only that, they also lost not only the 50th gate, which is the level of Haskala and wisdom of a tremendous level, but they also lost their relationship with the Shekhinah, which energized and supported their level of Ruchnius. So therefore God said to them, no longer will the Shekhinah be with you. No longer will be with you like it was before your time. Because all the people that lived before Matan Torah had the level where the Shekhinah in some way was intrinsically connected to them. So therefore they were on a much higher level, they were Shroshim. But from now on the Shekhinah will be outside of people. In other words, the Shekhinah was supposed to be inside the people, v'shachanti b'sochem, like it says, and it shall dwell in you. But after Matan Torah of the Chet of the Egel, the Shekhinah does not dwell in a person. Now it dwells outside of a person. The presence of God is now outside of a person. And it dwells where? It dwells now on a house, on a residence, on the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash represented the physical separation, in a certain sense, of the Shekhinah from the mind of man onto a building. And therefore you can sense the Shekhinah, the power of the Shekhinah, when you're near the building itself. So therefore Klal Yisrael was able to feel the Shekhinah when it was near in Yerushalayim and by the Beis HaMikdash and so on. The Beis HaMikdash now became the Mokum HaShoras HaShekhinah, the place where the Shekhinah, the presence of God, was most concentrated. But that was a descent. That was a descent from where the Shekhinah was before. Because now the Shekhinah was in a house. So therefore, after the Chet of the Egel, we see that Klal Yisrael lost the concept of the Nun. Again, they lost the Nun 50th gate. They lost the Madrega of being on the level of a Haskala. You see it? And finally, they also lost the Madrega of what? Of being close to the Shekhinah. So Klal Yisrael descended under levels. Now, when was the next time that Klal Yisrael was zocher to the Nun possibly? The next time that Klal Yisrael can again approach the level of Nun was at the time of Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. King Solomon was supposed to be the Mashiach ben David. That's right. Shlomo HaMelech was supposed to be the Mashiach and so on of that time. And therefore Shlomo HaMelech was the wisest of all men. There's a big question in my mind, who was wiser? Shlomo HaMelech or Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef? And that's a serious question. But Shlomo HaMelech was the wisest of all men. He knew tremendous amount of chokhmah in combination with the tremendous amount of ruchnius. Because of certain sins that Shlomo HaMelech did and the people of Klal Yisrael did, Shlomo HaMelech lost that ability to be the Mashiach. And it was removed. Not only that, not only was removed and therefore Shlomo HaMelech could not achieve the Nun, but also Klal Yisrael lost their Madrega. So Klal Yisrael after Shlomo HaMelech was divided into two parts. It was divided into the tribe of Yehuda and Levi, and that was separated from the 10 tribes. And the 10 tribes were ruled by the king called Yerovam ben Nevat. So at that time there was again the possibility that these tribes, even though they were separated and so on, could achieve the level of the 50th gate and restore the level of the Shekhinah and so on. but they weren't again worthy, and for certain sins that they did, they were not worthy. And Yerovam and Avot, Jeroboam in English, and Yerovam and Avot became a Russia, and therefore he instituted the concept of idol worship to the Jews. You see it, and therefore Klal Yisrael lost the ability totally to achieve again the possibility. They retained the ability of the Beis Hamikdash. They retained the Beis Hamikdash, and they therefore had somewhat of a distant relationship to the Shekhinah because it was occupied the Beis Hamikdash. It no longer returned to Klal Yisrael in their Priminius, in their inside, in their intrinsically, but they could connect to the Shekhinah through the Beis Hamikdash. You see it. But Klal Yisrael lost the ability to resurrect the concept of the Nun and bring the Mashiach and then raise the person to the level of Haskala, and from there to Zichuch go to the level of Olam Haba. So we therefore see, what do we see? We see that Klal Yisrael continuously loses the Madrega of Odom Rishon Koydem Achet. It continuously uses the madrega of Zichuch HaGuf, where the neshama and the body unify into one entity. It continues to lose the madrega of the Nun Sharabin of the 50th gate. And therefore it descends to a much slower madrega of where now they have a Beis Hamikdash and they don't have the Nun anymore, and so on and so forth. And not only that, they are in a new situation because Klal Yisrael is divided into two parts. The 10 tribes on one section, and now the tribe of Yehuda and Levi on the other section. So Klal Yisrael is not even one nation anymore. So it sinks even more rapidly than we see from before. So finally the 10 tribes go through idol worship because of what was instituted of Yehuda, and I'm not going to speak about that now. And therefore, suddenly, God punishes the 10 tribes by putting them into exile. Why? Because Assyria suddenly takes them away. Assyria takes them and brings them to Assyria itself, and therefore they become what's called the 10 lost tribes of Israel, where they separate from the Jewish people and from Eretz Yisrael, and they go into an exile permanently until the coming of the final Mashiach. And the only thing that remains of the Jewish people is the tribe of Yehuda and Levi, and so on, and some pieces of other tribes, but basically it's Yehuda and Levi, and so on. So Klal Yisrael, what's left of Klal Yisrael is the following. It's just 2 tribes left or so, and the Beis Hamikdash with the Shekhinah on it, and the Mem Teshar Bina, which is the 49 gates. So Klal Yisrael is an Moedik Madrege before, but Klal Yisrael still has the concept of prophecy. Even though Klal Yisrael lost all the Madregas of what it should have achieved, to go back to the Madrege of Adam Rishon before the sin, Klal Yisrael still had the power of Nevuah. They can still access that. In fact, it was said that the Gemara says that in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, for the 400 years or so that the first Beis Hamikdash survived, there were over 1 million Nevi'im in Klal Yisrael. So Klal Yisrael was still on a high madrega in terms of spirituality, because at least they had the ability to visit spirituality and so on indirectly. And they could do this through the province of Nevuah. But now God wanted to punish them in a totally different way. Because God was approaching the 4,000th year. And we said before that in the year 4,000 since the creation of the world, God was entering slowly the Moshe Mashiach. But God decided that because of the sins of the Jews that are mentioned in the Torah, because of the sins, God wanted to exile the Jews to Babylonia. And not only that, God wanted to do something that he never really did before. He wanted to destroy the Beis Hamikdash. So the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash would actually put the Shekhinah in total golus. Because while the Churban Beis Hamikdash of the first temple was destroyed, the Shekhinah would not have a place specifically designated where it would reside. So therefore, what ensued was the exile into Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar therefore brought his armies to Jerusalem and destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, and then rebelled, and therefore took all the Jews in Israel and took many of them, and then finally all of them to Babylonia. So the Jews now lived in Babylonia without the temple. So they were in total exile. And a lot of this had to do because of the sins between one Jew and another. As I've said many times before, the Jews stopped being an organism. The concept of the Jews as an organism is integral to the Jews' purpose of being a Goy Kodesh and a Mamlech Kohanim, a kingdom of priests. But because Jews had an unusual level of sin haschinem, jealousy and disrespect, and many sins of lashon hara and sin haschinem, unwanted hatred between them, they also lost this time the ability to live in Eretz Yisrael. And what I've said before, that Eretz Yisrael was part of the entity of Klal Yisrael. The entity of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people, and the entity of Eretz Yisrael, which was organismically related to the Jewish people. And the concept of what? The concept of the Torah, the 630 commandments, constituted one organism. It was a triad of three different things. The land, the mitzvahs, and the people were a triad as an organism. But when Bavel came down, when Nebuchadnezzar came down and took these people, the Jewish people, into Golus, and he destroyed the temple and so on and so forth, the Jews suddenly had a massive descent from Ruchnius. And it was the beginning of the end of the highest level of Ruchnius that the Jews ever achieved. Because when they were in the Golus of Bavel, they not only lost the land and the Beis Hamikdash and so on, they also lost the power of Nevuah. In other words, they lost the one thing that they still had from the time of the Chet of Adam Rishon, which was the ability to connect to Ruchnius on a distinct level. The exile of the Jews in Bavel then was only lasted for 70 years. And this comes to the story of Purim, because Persia became a very great kingdom of world power, and Persia conquered Babylonia. And therefore the Jews resided in Persia, and that was the whole story of Purim. But the story of Purim is distinct from the story before. The purpose of the exile of Persia was to test the Jews before God would resurrect the Beis Hamikdash. God had every intention of building the Beis Hamikdash as it existed before. He had every intention as it existed before, but not on the same level. But he had the intention to redeem the Jews and bring them back to the land of Israel and to rebuild the temple. But the temple that would be rebuilt would be a lower madrega than the first temple. So this is the period, the kufa of the second temple. The period of the second temple was already a tremendous diminishment of what the Jews had experienced before. Because when the Jews finally came back from Persia to Eretz Yisrael, they no longer had the power of Nevuah. Nevuah was taken away from them. And the desire to commit idolatry was also taken away. In other words, the connection between the Jewish people and true spirituality was suddenly diminished to a tremendous extent. So the Jews no longer had a desire for idol worship, because as I mentioned before, idol worship was a real impulse. It was a real desire to connect to spirituality, but it was a desire to connect to spirituality by being an arrogant person and taking control of spirituality. Instead of relating to spirituality by submitting to God, you related to spirituality by attempting to control the spiritual dimension through the Avodah Zorah. By worshiping an idols and the sacrifices to idols, you will actually control spiritual powers. And these were the powers of astrology, the power of the planets. Because those people at that time knew how to derive the energy from the planets to begin to control spiritual forces. So even though it was a sin, it was a very grave sin, it was a true spiritual enterprise. You know, don't think for a minute that idol worship was simply the worship of a foolhardy thing where people worshiped inanimate objects. They did not. Inanimate objects were simply symbols of objects for the planets. They were symbols of the planets, and the energy of spirituality came down to the planet Earth through the planets. That's why idol worship is called Avodas Kochavim Mazolos, the worship of planets and stars. That's the true essence of spirituality, to try and take advantage of the power to be able to worship the planets and believe that they are substitutes for God. The people who worship the idols believe that God created the world, but eventually he abandoned the world to the planets, and they had the energy to give this energy to people who would worship them. So therefore, the new gods that were now worshipped were the planets, and they were all symbolized by certain objects, and they were worshipped in that sense. So therefore, the whole relationship of man to spirit was now diminished a second time. It was diminished by Adam Arishan before the sin, the first time because of the sin of Adam Arishan, and it was now but that left the possibility of nevuah, of prophecy, but now it was diminished again a second time, because by the second Beit Hamikdash was built after the exile from Purim, the exile from Persia, now left nevuah in the dark. So no longer could great men accomplish the spirit of spirituality. Instead, spirituality descended and diminished into a new madrega. And what was that madrega called? That madrega was called Ruach HaKodesh. That's right. So we see that there are three levels of spiritual contact that mankind went through. The first level of contact was the one Adam Arishan had before he sinned. And that was the level of contact with spirituality, with actually he could sense the spirituality in him. The second level was spirituality that the people can contact was the concept of nevuah, prophecy. But that still allowed man to visit the universe of spirituality and know what was going on there. Finally, mankind, or the Jewish people now, which represented mankind, lost even that level, and they went down to the level of called Ruach HaKodesh, which the Gemara says still remains in the world. So the Jews still have a level of spirituality called Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, where they can know things which you cannot know by logic and reason. When a person has Ruach HaKodesh, he knows things that you cannot know by logic or by observation or by experimentation. It's a form of knowledge that's not inferential. It's not done by inference. It's done by being aware, directly experiencing a certain spiritual influence that a person has on him that tells him certain truths about spirituality, but it's on a much lower level than nevuah, than prophecy. So by the time Purim, which is the holiday which ended the dominion of nevuah in the world, was the Gula of Purim was done through natural law. It was not done with apparently any miracles. Two things disappeared from the world in the story of Purim: the possibility of miracles, open miracles where a person can actually see a miracle. All of mankind was able to be visible. The concept of sorcery, the concept of magic, all these things were possible before the story of Purim, because along with the spirit of prophecy, the connection to spirituality was much greater, was much more direct. So these three things, kishuv, magic and witchcraft, and nevuah and prophecy, at that time the ones who ruled the world were prophets, and they were the witchcraft, and they were witches, machashrim, that ruled the world, and nevuah, and this is what ruled the world, because mankind had direct access to spirituality. But after the story of Purim, there was no longer any direct access. The access that mankind had to spirituality was much more indirect. It was now on the level of Ruach HaKodesh, which is much lower than that. But what took the place of nevuah? If Ruach HaKodesh took the place of nevuah, which is a diminished form of contact with spirituality, the question now really is, what took the place of nevuah? You see it. And the truth is, this is where we enter the story of Hanukkah. Because what took the place of Nevuah as a Chokhmah and so on and so forth was a certain level of Chokhmah would be an ascendancy. That's right. Something strange occurred. Even though Nevuah diminished and mankind went down in terms of the ability to be a Navi. Mankind went down in the ability of being a Navi. But mankind actually ascended in Chokhmah. In other words, why was that? Because by the time of Hanukkah, which occurs in the year about 170, which occurs in the year 170 BCE, which is the story of Hanukkah, it represented a certain period which approaches the period of 4,000 years. Like we have said before, the year 4000 represents the Yemos Mashiach. It represents the beginning of the Yemos Mashiach, which should have happened in a pure way. But instead, the Yemos Mashiach went into a Golus. But what happened was the concept of Chokhmah was increased. So even though mankind distanced himself from spirituality because he lost the power of Nevuah, and the power of Nevuah descended to the power of Ruach HaKodesh, in one way he ascended. He went higher. That's right. How did he go higher? Because suddenly, as I've said before, and this is a very powerful concept that you have to understand, the concept of Haskala. Haskala is different than Chokhmah. Chokhmah is the ability to understand the mechanisms of spirituality, how it functions. It's only what are the mechanics it functions, what are the systems that it functions, what determines what happens to a person spiritually, why does God do what he does, how did God create the world, how does he manage the world, how does he supervise the world. All these mechanisms and systems are known through Haskala. In other words, it's the concept of Chokhmah ascending to the highest madrega of Chokhmah, and that's the Nun Sharabina. So therefore, the strange oxymoron started to happen. Even though mankind was losing the power of Nevuah, the power to directly experience spirituality through Nevuah, he was increasing in his power of Chokhmah to understand the world, to understand the laws of cause and effect, to understand logic, to understand philosophy, to understand science. But he can only apply that Chokhmah to physicality. In other words, mankind suddenly became involved in the derech of the Nun. God was bringing down the methodology of the Nun, of the 50th gate. That's right. Why? Because it was slowly approaching at the year 170. About that time, you're only 100 or so, 200 years away from the initiation of the Yemos Mashiach. The Yemos Mashiach was supposed to start in the year 4000, which corresponded approximately to the year 100 ACE. So because we were gradually going to that year, God said, I'm going to bring down the 50th gate and give it to the Mashiach, who was Rabbi Akiva at that time. We have been speaking about that up till now. But since God was about to bring down the 50th gate, God therefore was increasing the level of Chokhmah to the 50th level. So even though God didn't bring down the total 50th gate, then he was starting to bring down the Chokhmah of the 50th gate. That's right. The Chokhmah of the 50th gate, which is the ability to understand events. You have to understand what I mean by Haskala. It's the ability to understand events. Now, there are two types of events. There are spiritual events, which is concept of the Hanukkah, why God does what he does. God operates in spiritual events. And there are laws which he basically works the spiritual events. God brings every spiritual event because of a certain reason. There's a cause and effect relationship between what God does to the world. God functions as a Dayan, he's the judge of the world. You know, we say, he's the Dayan of the world, he's the Dayan Emes, He's a judge of the world, and he's also merciful. And both of these attributes which God functions through, the concept of justice and the concept of mercy, functions through the principles of logic, the principles of cause and effect. God does what he does through certain basic principles of a mechanism. That's right. And this mechanism is studied by the 50th gate. If you understand the 50th gate, you suddenly comprehend the mechanism in which God functions in the physical and spiritual universe. You understand the complete mechanism of spirituality, why God does what he does, how God does what he does, and when he does what he does. You understand the causes of all his behaviors, how he responds to behavior of man. When man does mitzvahs and sins, that causes God through the spheres to reciprocate according to certain behavior patterns, which are called spiritual events. Spiritual events of war, spiritual events of suffering, spiritual events of ruchnius, of Shechina, spiritual events of high knowledge, of high elevated kedusha. All these are fundamental events that happen because of the deeds of men. And the relationship between the events, the results of spirituality that man achieves, and what he does, his maisim, is governed by cause and effect relationships, by certain things that what man does is what man gets. And this is a mechanism. And this mechanism applies not only to the physical world, it causes the laws of physics and biology and chemistry to rule the physical world, but it also applies to the laws that apply to the spiritual world. The anhogas of the Banacham of justice and mercy apply to the spiritual world. And the study of the mechanisms that produce these things is the study of the 50th gate. So therefore, the 50th gate is the application of Chokhmah to Gashmias and Ruchnius. But the 50th gate was never given to the world. So therefore, the world, even though Nevuah was able to access information about spirituality, they never totally really understood. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu says to God, why do you do what you do? Why do you punish tzaddikim so severely, like when Moshe Rabbeinu saw in the future, when he saw that God punished the 10 martyrs, the Asura Amoga Malchus, God said to him, it's because it's the Gezerah. But God did not explain to Moshe Rabbeinu what he does. He refused to explain it. Because at that time, God said, you are allowed to and you can reach the level of relating to spirituality. You are a Navi and the greatest Navi of all. So I will allow you to access spirituality through your level of Nevuah, but I will not allow you to truly understand this. To truly understand this, you have to have the light of Mashiach, and you have not been worthy of this light, because the Jews worship the golden calf. So therefore the world never received the light. So the application of the knowledge of the mechanism and cause and effect relationship of all the events that happen in reality, the events that occur in the physical world, the events that occur in the spiritual world, and the unity of all events, so that they reflect the power and the unity of God, cannot be understood without the 50th gate. And God did not give that 50th gate to the Nevi'im. Even though they can experience intuitively the spiritual world, they could not necessarily understand it. But now God removed Nevuah from the world. He removed the ability to experience spirituality and only left it with a diminished form of spirituality, which is called Ruach HaKodesh. But strangely enough, just as Ruach HaKodesh started to come into the world, and that was the level of spirituality of mankind, God started to ascend, to increase the level of Chokhmah. So God granted mankind, and especially the Jewish people, with the ability to understand how to understand an event, period. How do you understand an event? Physical and spiritual. He decided to give this knowledge and this chokhmah to not only the Jews, but he decided to give this knowledge to mankind. That's why at that period of time, suddenly the concept of chokhmah, the chokhmah of this methodology, this understanding of Haskala, He allowed mankind to apply this Chokhmah to the physical universe only. He kept it from mankind so they could not understand it from the spiritual standpoint. So mankind could not understand what God does spiritually, which is called Anhogas. But he allowed mankind the knowledge of how to understand what God's doing physically. So therefore, what was this rise? Where do we see this rise of the Chokhmah, the Haskala, as applies to the physical universe? That's very important to understand, that this is something which is not realized. Haskala has to do with the 50th gate. It has to do with the light of Mashiach. There's the Haskala that has to do with the spiritual world, the world of Ruchnius, and there's the Haskala that has to do with what? With the physical world. And there's Haskala which unites the physical and spiritual into what's called a unified theory of spirituality and physicality, which can only be obtained by this Haskala, which is the ability to understand events as they occur. Because of the proximity of the second temple to the Yemais Mashiach, when God decided to bring down the 50th gate, God allowed this Haskala to develop as regards the physical universe, but not the spiritual universe. And this Haskala was given to a certain nation. How was it given to this nation? Because the Shekhinah went into a second Golus. When the Shekhinah went into the Beis HaMikdash and was represented by a building, the Shekhinah went into Golus. When the Shekhinah left man and resided in his heart and went from man into a building called a Beis HaMikdash, it's a descent, it's an exile. So therefore we can see the Madrega of Klal Yisrael and its relation to the Shekhinah by the different types of temples that are developed. To go from the first temple to the second temple and then to no temple tells us clearly that the Shekhinah is going into exile and the descent of spirituality. That's how we can see the relationship of spirituality to mankind. So what you saw, that when the Shekhinah went from the first temple and it was destroyed, and then it went into Golus. But then when the Jews went back to Eretz Yisrael and built a second temple, and the Shekhinah was, you found that the Beis HaMikdash has fewer miracles than it had before. Whereas before the Shekhinah represented the Oren and they represented the Menorah, many miracles that were done. In the simple temples, many of these miracles were missing. They were hidden by the sages at that time. So therefore, the second temple was a different structure than the first temple because it represented a different level of exile of the Shekhinah. The first temple represented an exile of the Shekhinah that came from the heart. The second temple represented an exile from the Shekhinah greater than the exile of the first temple, and therefore it represented the level of Ruach HaKodesh. It no longer represented the level of Nevuah, but Ruach HaKodesh. But at the same time, because that level, because the story of Purim, and after that the story of Hanukkah, had to do with the beginning of the Yemais Mashiach as it was decided by God, even though the spiritual ability of mankind to interact with spirituality through Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh, it descended. But what ascended, what went up, what was elevated, was the concept of Haskala as it relates to the physical universe. God wanted to give the Haskala of the physical universe to mankind so that they suddenly should understand how the universe as a physical entity operates. So he gave them the methodology of this. And to which nation did he give? It was when the Shekhinah went into Golus, second temple, to which nation did it go to? And which nation proceeded to increase the chokhmah of the world through this new level of Haskala? And that was the level, that was the nation of Yavon, Greece. Greece was the vessel nation that received the exile of the Shekhinah after it went into the Golus of the second Beis HaMikdash. That's right. The second Beis HaMikdash was much lower in level, Madrega, than the first. And therefore it represented a new Madrega of exile of the Shekhinah. And therefore the Shekhinah therefore went to a certain nation, which was the Golus of the Shekhinah of that nation. But when the Shekhinah is in a nation, in Golus in a nation, it empowers that nation in a certain way. and it empowered the nation of Greece with the light of the 50th gate as it applies to the Haskala that relates to physical events. That's why Greece became the foundation of Chokhmah. When Chazal say, Im yesh chokhmah b'goyim tamen, v'im yesh Torah b'goyim al tamen. You can believe when the goyim have achieved chokhmah, but you cannot believe that the goyim received Torah. And what does Chazal mean? Well, one of the ways Chazal mean, chokhmah represents what? Represents the methodology of the nun. That's right. The methodology of the nun, Sharebina, is Chokhmah. But the methodology as it's applied to Ruchnius, as it's applied to spirituality, and therefore gives you the ability to understand what God is doing, that applies to Torah. The Goyim were not given Torah. They are not given access to spiritual information. They weren't given access to spiritual information by Nevuah, except with certain exceptions, and so on, and only then in concert with witchcraft and so on and so forth. But they were not given true nevuah, and therefore they're not given true understanding of Haskala when it relates to spirituality. No. But what the exile of the Shechina in Greece, in Yavon, did give them was the Haskala, the level of the nun as it applies to physical reality. And therefore you see Greece, therefore, rose up to be a very special nation. In what way? And it's a very important to understand the Madrega of Yavon, the Madrega of Greece, and the destiny of Greece. And this has a lot to do with the story of Hanukkah. The destiny of Greece is said to be the foundation of Western civilization. There are many historians, and this I've heard from professors and so on, that they all say that the study of human history after Greece is purposeless, because they say Greece created Western civilizations and it has continued from Greece, ancient Greece. Why? Because Greece suddenly changed. The first thing that Greece developed was the study of logic and the study of philosophy and metaphysics. In fact, just to show you how they did study, for example, how do you say the word essence in Hebrew? How do you say when you want to say the word essence in Hebrew? The word essence in Hebrew, there is no Hebrew word that really applies to essence. I mean, essence in a certain ways can be said to be what? It can be said to be Priminius. But Priminius doesn't mean essence. Priminius means simply the internal aspect. But how do you say essence in Hebrew? And essence is a very important term in philosophy, because essence represents the definition of an entity. It represents what an entity is. And how do you say that word, essence of something? Does anyone know?
Mahus?
Mahus.
Right, mahus. But the word mahus is a medieval word. I don't know if you know this. Mahus does not appear in biblical Hebrew, and it doesn't appear in Talmudic, in Mishnaic Hebrew. The word mahus comes from the word mahu. Two words combined together. Mahu. What is it? But that word put together means mahus. The word mahus means essence. But mahus is not a Hebrew word. It's a word which is developed from two Hebrew words, and it did not exist in biblical or Mishnaic times. It is a medieval word created by philosophy, by the attachment of philosophy to Torah. So therefore you see that Chazal were not concerned, Chazal, who were the sages of Israel, were not concerned with the essence of philosophy, with reason and with logic. Chazal never wrote a book on logic, and so on. The first one who wrote a book on logic, and it's one of the greatest books of all, is the Organon, and was written by Aristotle. The name of the book is the Organon, and it's a book on how to think. The first man who wrote a book on how to think, what constitutes truth, what constitutes validity and reasoning and so on, and constitutes the essence, were the Greeks, was Aristotle. The Greeks started philosophy with Socrates, even before Socrates. The first concept of science was started from Thales of Miletus. Thales, who lived in the Greek city of Miletus in about the year 400 BCE. Socrates started logic and argumentation and philosophy, and he had a student Plato, and he had a student Aristotle, who was perhaps one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And Aristotle wrote a textbook on logic, and it's a magnificent book. I mean, Chazal never wrote a textbook on philosophy. Why? Because that was not their thing. The aspect of Chazal was to talk about Torah. And to talk about Torah is really to talk about what? To talk about Torah was basically the ability to talk about what? The Taryag Mitzvahs. The Taryag Mitzvahs is the concept of talking about Torah. And they doused in the Taryag Mitzvahs. That was the tachlis of Chazal. The tachlis was not to talk about philosophy or thinking or anything like that. You know, Chazal never wrote anything or said anything on how to think. You see it? In fact, the interesting thing is both the Rambam and the Ramchal, with Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, do you know what the first book the Rambam wrote? The Rambam, Maimonides. The Rambam, the first book that he wrote when he was 16 or 17 years old was Milatari Goyen. What was it? It was a book on philosophy, on logic. And where did he take that information? Well, he took it from the Organon of Aristotle. That's right. Before the Rambam wrote the Pirush Mishnayos, and before he wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, he wrote which are books on Torah, the philosophy of Torah. The Rambam wrote a book on logic, which was taken from the Greeks. And the Ramchal wrote what? Sefer Goyen. Where did he take that from? He also based it on Aristotle. And that's one of the first books that he wrote. So why are these Rishonim, the Rishon, the Rambam, and the Achron, Ramchal, why is it that they thought it so important to write a book on logic? If it was not so important, they would never have done it. But they realized that it was critical, that the study of logic and the study of philosophy or the study of metaphysics was critical. And this was all fundamentally taken from the Greeks. I mean, the Vilna Gaon says that the Rambam was influenced by the philosophy of Aristotle. And because the Rambam had no other philosophy fundamentally, he was not a Makubal. So therefore, he based the Moreh Nevuchim on the philosophy of Aristotle. So therefore, we see a tremendous thing. We see that the Rambam based his entire Moreh Nevuchim, which is his book on the Hashkafa of Yiddishkeit, he based it on the philosophy of Aristotle. So therefore, we see an amazing thing, that Chochmah, philosophy, metaphysics, logic, which is created by all the Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and so on, all the philosophers, there were many philosophers in ancient Greece, developed the whole area of philosophy. You see it. And this was a major achievement. This was the first time that mankind developed a system of intellectual power, true intellectual power that came from logic. Chas v'shalom, we're not saying that the sages of Israel didn't have intellectual power. They had tremendous intellectual power, but they never formalized it. They never formalized it in any way to teach Klal Yisrael. They formalized Torah, and that was their thing. But when God wanted to give down the Nun Sharei Bina in the area of what? In the area of physicality, he gave Greece, by the exile of the Shekhinah in Greece, Teferes B'yad Sor, beauty in the hands of the enemy. And that beauty in the hands of the enemy is the Nun Sharei Bina. So therefore, it was the residence of the Shekhinah in exile in Greece that allowed Greece to study, be worthy of the tremendous hashpah of the Nun Sharei Bina as it applies to reasoning and so on. It also did something else. Greece started science. That's right. Science started with Greece. Who did it start with? It started with Aristotle, first of all. Well, really, it started with Thales of Miletus, who was considered the father of science. It started with Aristotle, and it started with one other Greek, who was an absolute genius. In fact, it's known that just as professors say that Greece started Western civilization. That is not even necessary to study all the aspects of Western civilization after Greece, because every foundation of Western civilization comes from ancient Greece. That's right. And they also say every aspect of science also comes. But this case, it's not from Aristotle. Who was the greatest person in the science? They see who was an absolute genius. In fact, this ancient Greek actually discovered the principles of the calculus. He was able to calculate the area of a curve because he understood the fundamental principles of the integral calculus. Does anyone know who that person was?
Archimedes?
Right, very good. Who said that? Okay. I'm impressed. Archimedes. Archimedes knew the laws of machines, the laws of buoyancy, and so on and so forth. He was one of the greatest of all the Greek scientists, and so on. And scientists say that if science followed Archimedes 2,000 years ago and did not follow Aristotle, it was a mistake. Philosophy followed Aristotle, but science followed Aristotle too, and that was a mistake because Aristotle did not believe in so much experimentation and observation and measurement. And therefore, Aristotle did not have the true scientific method, but the concept of observing reality and formulating the laws of reality, Aristotle did make. But Archimedes was much greater in that sense because Archimedes actually invented the scientific method and so on. And it says that if science that we have today had followed Archimedes instead of Aristotle, we would be 2,000 years ahead of ourselves. That's right. We would have had molecular biology and nuclear physics 2,000 years ago. But because we followed Aristotle, we did not have that. So you see the tremendous thing that with the Greece. So therefore, Greece had a bracha. It had the bracha of the nun of Haskala as it applies to the full universe. You see it. And this was very great. Greek also did theater. They formulated theater. They made the first plays. I mean, Euripides and a lot of these Greek people formulated the theaters. In Greece, they used to have plays. And where the different plays represented different moralities or different things, like Oedipus and so on. There's different concepts and different things which were exemplified by theater. And Greece had a beautiful form of art. Therefore, Greece is called Tiferes, beauty. If you ever look at the Parthenon, I don't know if ever you've been in Greece, but if you look at the Parthenon, it is a magnificent structure. Egypt had magnificent structures, but the structures of Egypt were more like bulk. They were massive structures, and they were beautiful structures. But the beauty truly is manifest in Greek art, in the sculpture of the Greek, the Parthenon, in the statues of Greek, and so on and so forth. Greek had beauty in terms of its art. Greek also invented democracy, a political theory, where suddenly was the first country in the world to give fundamental human rights. Of course, it would only give fundamental human rights to its citizens. If you were a citizen of Greece, you had human rights in Greece. You see it. If you were a slave in Greece, you didn't have human rights. But it fundamentally was the first nation on earth that instituted human rights to its and considered its people as subjects and as citizens. The concept of a citizen was invented in Greece. So therefore we see that ancient Greece was a bedrock of tremendous chokhmah and so on. But there was one thing that Greece did which was very bad. Even though Greece had the Haskala of the nun in terms of chokhmah, in that sense, it had an amazing amount of that. But there was one thing that it did bad. And the reason why it had this chokhmah was why? Because this was nearing the era of Yemos HaMashiach. That's why God decided to put the Shimon in Golus, in the Golus of Greece, and therefore give Greece the Tiferes Piatzor, the nun, in the form of logic, reasoning, science, art, democracy, and so on. This was the beginning of the Haskala as it applies to man and the physical universe. But even if this were true, there's one thing about Greece which was not good. Greece worshipped man and not God. In other words, as far as Greece was concerned, man was the most perfect and the human form was perfection. Greece invented the Olympics, where man would compete against each other in physical sports, in physical skills. Greece many times made statues of man. Sculpture before Greece was not about man, it was about animals that symbolized astrology. It symbolized the planets, and then the people worshipped the planets in terms of Avodah Zarah. But the architect, but sculpture was not about man. Greece was the first nation that really made sculpture about man, human figures and so on. And it was beautiful done, right? And their sculptures are magnificent. And so on, in terms of this. And all sculpture and all art, fundamentally, especially sculpture, come from ancient Greece. But not only did Greece marvel at mankind, it marveled at man, and it marveled at his intellect. So therefore, what Greece focused on was man himself, the way he looked, the skills that he possessed, the form of man, but also the intellect of man. Greece believed that true Chokhmah can only be attained through logic and reason. You see it? That's the ability of only Chokhmah. And therefore, Greece worshipped the intellect of man, the mind of man, and the intellect. So what Greece did was it worshipped man. It no longer considered God as the center or focus of the universe. It wasn't concerned with the creation of the universe or how God ruled the universe. It had some sense of God because it did worship idols at the early point. But by the time Greece became philosophical and scientific, Greek religion started to go downhill. You know, the concept of the Greek gods, Zeus and Poseidon and Hades and so on and so forth, all the gods of ancient Greece start to go out of style. So in the area of Avodah Zarah, ancient Greece, which is in the 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th, 8th century, at the time of the Iliad and so on and so forth, of Homer, Greece was a country that worshipped idols. But by the time of Thales and Miletus in the year 400 or 500 and 300, in the time of Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, Greece became philosophically oriented and worshipping the intellect of man. And therefore, the religion of ancient Greece, which was idol worship, began to diminish and so on and so forth. It was picked up by Rome. It was. But it was really diminished in Greece. But that was the thing. Greece no longer believed in a spiritual universe. That's right. Ruchnius was no longer the focus of ancient Greece. Man was the focus of ancient Greece. And man, in a certain sense, was his mind, his mazel, the rights of man. The reason why Greece became democratic, because they worshipped man. Man was like a godlike figure. And even the gods themselves had man-like things. Zeus, for example, who was the ancient god of Greece, the super god of Greece, was seen as a man. And the events of his life were man-made. You know, he got married, Hera, and so on and so forth. And all the gods of Egypt, Poseidon, which was Neptune in Rome, all these people were figures of man. In other words, Greece actually humanized God. They humans God. They God in human form, and they God the activity of man. The gods did the same thing that man did. That's why Greek mythology is filled with stories of all the gods, the different gods that acted like man. They had affairs, and they had demons, and then they had magic and so on. But in many ways, they behaved like man, because Greek placed man at the center of the universe, and because Greece worshipped man as the focus of the universe, he believed that therefore man has certain divine rights, which was democracy. So therefore, Greek was the first one that began to respect man as a figure to be worshipped. But there was therefore one thing that Greece did that was very bad. It worshipped man and not God. It discontinued the belief in God and increased the worship of man. And this was in direct conflict with, guess what? The rise of the Haskala. even though the Haskala of the Chochmah of Greece came from the Nun, and it was the Nun that as it applied to a physical reality, but it was a form of Avodah Zarah, because it worshipped man and disregarded the Shlita of God. So therefore, what happened was a very interesting thing, and it was bound to happen. As soon as God raised the level of intellect to the level of Nun and the pursuit of the Nun, suddenly Greek wisdom contradicted the Torah. That's right. And the Jewish people suddenly emerged into tremendous conflict. Because suddenly the Jews realized, hey, there's something going on here. And you have to understand something, a very powerful thing is on. How do we know that God wanted Greece to be the purveyor of wisdom and the purveyor of the type of wisdom of the Nun, so that man with his intellect could begin to dominate the world? How do we really know this? Because we see through the rise of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was one of the greatest emperors in the world. He conquered the whole known world of his time. It was astonishing. He was a man in his 20s. He died in his 30s. He was a man in his 20s. And in the 10 years or so that he was a general, with his Greek army, he almost conquered the world. His empire included India, that's right, Pakistan. Alexander was the son of the king of Macedonia, Philip of Macedonia. And when Macedonia died, he took over Macedonia, which is in northern Greece, is a northern country of Greece. And he decided that he wanted to conquer the world. Why? Because who was the Rabbi of Alexander the Great? His Rabbi, his teacher, was none other than Aristotle. That's right. Alexander the Great was the student of Aristotle, and he picked up the whole spirit of Greek wisdom from Aristotle. And he said, this is so good, this is so powerful, that I want to spread it to the world. Therefore, I'm going to go conquer the world. And he did. With his Greek army and his Greek tactics, he conquered the world. He conquered the whole Mediterranean. And then he conquered also what? He went east. He conquered Persia. He conquered the Persian Empire. He conquered Babylonia and so on. He went so far east that he conquered the Medes and the Persians. He conquered the India and Pakistan. In other words, he was the emperor of the world. There are many people who set Alexander the Great as a model. That's right. There were like the Roman Caesar. I think Caesar of Rome once said, I really mourn the fact that I am not as great as Alexander the Great, because this one person in 10 years conquered the whole known world. And all I could do was conquer pieces of Europe and the Mediterranean. Emperors and generals envied Alexander the Great. But how do I know? So therefore, the tachlis of Alexander the Great was to spread Greek wisdom throughout the world. And Greek wisdom was called Hellenism. So therefore, Aristotle and all the Greek philosophers created Hellenism, which was the Chochmah of Hellenism, which is the Chochmah of Greece. And Alexander the Great was the instrument which would spread that Chochmah throughout the world. It would change the world from direct access of Nevuah to indirect access of Chochmah. Chochmah was spread through Alexander the Great. And how do we know that this was what God wanted? Because Alexander the Great reached Jerusalem. And when he came to Yerushalayim, he wanted to conquer Yerushalayim. And when he came into Yerushalayim, he suddenly saw Shimon HaTzadik. And he said, and he bowed down to Shimon HaTzadik. What? The greatest general on earth should bow down to a high priest of the Jews? So his assistant generals asked him, why are you doing that? So he said, because before I conquered every country, I saw this man came to me in a dream. And this is the man who came to me in a dream. I see his face. And he told me what to do and how to conquer it. So therefore, I have to really worship this man. This man is like something special. He was probably sent by God to tell me what the things are, what I should do to conquer the world. So therefore, that's why many Jews name their children Alexander. That's right. Why are Jews named Alexander after Alexander the Great, who was a goy? because Alexander the Great, when he came to Jerusalem, he refused to conquer Jerusalem, and he let Jerusalem be free. So therefore, in recognition of what Alexander the Great, that he did not conquer Jerusalem in a negative way, but that he respected Shimon HaTzadik, therefore they named their children. His name became one of the names that Jews named their children Alexander. So what does that mean that Shimon HaTzadik appeared to Alexander the Great in a dream? What does that mean? Well, that is God. That is God sending him a shaliach, Shimon HaTzadik, to teach Alexander the Great how to spread Hellenism throughout the world. Why? Because God wanted Hellenism to go throughout the world, because Hellenism is the beginning of Western civilization. Western civilization, fundamentally in its foundations, is the civilization based on Chokhmah. You know what I mean? All democracy and everything we know, Bill of Rights, Constitution, all these things come from ancient Greece. And since God wanted this Chokhmah to take over the world because it was part of the Golus of the Yemos Mashiach, which I've explained sometimes in the past and so on, and I will continue to explain. But this was the Hashgacha Pfotis, that God wanted this to spread throughout the world. So God therefore gave koyach to Alexander the Great to spread this wisdom throughout the world. And you have to understand this. God wanted this himself, because this was the beginning of the Yemos Mashiach, because it included Haskala. True, it did not conclude Haskala, in terms of Torah. Haskala was not combined with Torah, and therefore Chazal never really taught Haskala, because the Nun was not given to Chazal. But fundamentally, it applied itself to the physical universe, and mankind began to develop Haskala from the thing. Why do you think science is so great today? I mean, it's marvelous, When you look at a phone, a cellular phone, and you see with this small object that I hold in my hand, I can talk to any human being on the planet Earth. I can talk to someone in China with this little thing. I can actually talk to a person 12,000 miles away, 15,000 miles away. It's an absolute miracle. And God wanted this mankind to begin to have this technology, because technology comes from science. The ability to use scientific principles to actually create instruments of power is done through technology. You see it. And God wanted this. God wanted this because this is the doorway to Haskala. That's right. And in certain ways, the fact that the 10 martyrs died, they died to give Haskala to the Goyim. That's why Rome and Christianity are the greatest nations on earth. Because this Haskala has to go through them, because the Yemos Mashiach, the days of the Mashiach, is on Golus. And it has to go through the Mamlech Kohanim, in which God chose to be a surrogate Mamlech Kohanim to give this Chokhmah. So this is, I will speak about this later on when I talk about this, and I talk about the Kabbalah. But this is not the place to do it. So therefore, the Chokhmah of Greece is part of the intention of God in the Hashgacha Pfotis. But the problem of Greece was the fact that this Chokhmah contradicted the Torah, because Greece worshipped man and everything about man, and disregarded God. It disregarded the concept of Hashgacha Pfotis. It disregarded the whole concept of Ruchnius. So therefore, when Alexander the Great died and his empire was taken over, it split into 3 parts. It was split into the part where it was taken over by Antoninus, who was the emperor that took over the part of Alexander the Great's empire of Syria and Israel and so on. And then it was also taken over, it was represented, Alexander after his death was represented in Egypt by Ptolemy. The Ptolemies of Egypt took over from Alexander the Great and became the pharaohs of Egypt. Antoninus became the king of Judea and Syria and many of the nations in that part of the world, and also in Greece. So after Alexander the Great died, and Hellenism was continued to spread around the world, And therefore, when in Antoninus wanted to spread Hellenism in Yerushalayim because he took over the Hellenism of Alexander the Great. But in this case, the only real spiritual nation on earth, the only nation in the world which did not worship Avodah Zarah without a true worship was of the Rabbanah Shalom, was Klal Yisrael. And Hellenism was in direct contradiction to the Torah. How so? Because you have to imagine what happened to a Jew at that time. A Jew who lived in the time of Antoninus, who took over after Alexander the Great died. What did a Jew see? He saw Hellenism, because Hellenism was spread all over Yerushalayim, all over Israel. And when he looked at the Torah and he said, this document is a very strange document, the Torah. Why? Because the Torah sounds like a book of magic. If you read the Torah, what is the Torah really about? It's the story of Klal Yisrael and Matan Torah and Yetzias Mitzrayim. But in that story, there were men who talked to God. That was a nevuah. But there were no more any prophets in the world. Prophets had disappeared for hundreds of years. There was no prophet. Malachi, the last prophet and part of the Anshe Knesset Doila, died in terms of the story of Purim. And there were no more prophets in the world. So therefore, the Jews, when they looked at the Torah, they say, this book doesn't seem to be relevant. Why? Because this book talks about men who talk to God, about open miracles, about men who threw down their staff and it became snakes. Moshe Rabbeinu threw down a staff, it became a snake. Moshe Rabbeinu did 10 makkahs. Each makkah was a nace, was an open miracle. Well, the world was no longer about open miracles. There was no such thing. So these stories were fables. They were like fables to the Jews. Many Jews saw these stories as fables. That's right. They were like mythological fables. Men who could talk to God. Men who were someone had godly powers who can do open miracles. You know, the whole Torah is filled with these stories, and even Tanakh is filled with these stories. So therefore, the Jews at that time began to become Hellenists. They said, well, Hellenism makes much more sense. It's about logic. It's about intellect. It's about philosophy. It's about science and technology. It's about art and theater and democracy. The principles of Greek philosophy and Greek chokhmah were completely different than what was envisioned in the Torah. And not only that, the Torah looked like it was a contradiction to Greek philosophy, because the Torah focused on God. Greek philosophy focused on man, not God. So therefore, the two of these philosophies, the philosophy of Torah and the philosophy of Hellenism, were at direct odds. And therefore, this was the beginning of the war of Hanukkah. So therefore, you see that the story of Hanukkah is very different than what you imagine. You think that the story of Hanukkah is about Greeks, right, who simply went to war with the Jews because they wanted the Jews to worship idols or something like that. That's not what it's about. It's really a war between Greek chokhmah, which God wanted, and the Torah, which God wanted. God wanted the Torah to tell mankind that He was the center of creation. He was the center of the universe. He was the center of the Hashgacha. And the avodah of the Rabbanah Shalom is the Ika avodah. But at the same time, God wanted Haskala in the world, that man should combine chokhmah with ruchnius, and therefore truly understand how God does what He does, and therefore be zocheh to olam haba. But Greek took only one part of that. Greece took only one part of that. It took the concept of science and philosophy and logic and so on. It took all these other things and so on and created a new religion, a religion that absented God from it. It had nothing to do with God. It had everything to do with man as believing in himself. Man suddenly believed in himself and in his own power, in his own intellect, in his own skills, in his own form. So therefore, man, Greece, I should say, limited the Haskala. The Haskala was therefore to present itself to mankind as a way, as a path to understand Ruchnius. But instead, Greece took that Haskala and limited it to the physical universe. But in limiting it to the physical universe, it limited it to the focus on man. And this contradicted totally the concept of Torah. So therefore, Hanukkah is not a story between the Jews and the Greeks. It's a story of Hellenism versus Torah. That's the story of Hanukkah. And this is critical to understand. And these were not accidents, because Hanukkah takes place right before the Yemos HaMashiach, right before God revealed the Nun Sharabina to Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef, and intended to bring this light to the world in terms of the physical universe and the spiritual universe. God intended to give this 50th gate in terms of spiritual events, ruchnistic events, hashkocha, Maisa Brachus, Maisa Makova, and Maisa Brachus and science and technology. He intended to unify both of these things, and mankind should achieve a tremendous Haskala with both of these things. Greek, which is a nation of Goyim, limited the Haskala, the Nun, to just man, and created, therefore, a religion of the worship of man, which now totally contradicted. And Greece had a winning argument. In a certain sense, you can't blame the Jews, because the Jews looked at a book about magic, about witchcraft, about sorcery, about prophets. These people no longer existed on the world. A Jew who lived at the time of Hanukkah never saw a prophet in his life. He never saw a sorcerer in his life. He never saw an open miracle in his life. That's right. This was all history. No Jew at that time ever saw or witnessed. They had the Beis Hamikdash, but many of these miracles no longer existed in the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash did have certain supernatural events, but much less than it had before. And there was a certain power to Greek wisdom that was incredibly enticing to the Jewish people, and therefore many Jews became Hellenists. They could not reconcile Greek philosophy and science with the Torah. And their weight was for the Greek philosophy and science. So what happened? What's the story of Hanukkah? So Matasyahu, who was the high priest at that time, said, but so what? Even if Hellenism may be true at a certain point, it represents a certain level of Haskala when it comes to Maisa Adam, when it comes to physical universe, but it completely absents the own world of Ruchnius. And the essence of the Torah is our relationship with the Rabbanu Shalom. Man is not alone, and mankind does not possess the strength or the wisdom to go it alone. The physical universe is not the only part of the universe. The world is fundamentally Ruchnius, and the Ika destiny of the world, the physical world, is to become Ruchnius. That's the concept of Olam Haba. So therefore, Matasyahu fought for the belief in the Torah view of the universe, God and man, as opposed to the Hellenistic view of the universe and man and science. They were two contradictory philosophies. So Matasyahu said, we will not accept Hellenism. So therefore Matasyahu declared war against the Greeks. Now, did Matasyahu expect to win? You know that there were 8 times more soldiers that Antoninus had than the Jews had? His soldiers numbered 8-1 against the Jews. So how did they expect to win that battle? They didn't. But Matasyahu said to them the following: we have to fight for the Rebbeinu Shalom, and we have to, even if it means our lives. And if we are Zocher, the Rebbeinu Shalom will allow us to win. That's right. Even though that army is 8 times larger than us, we will win the war, because the Rebbeinu Shalom will give us a Siyata Dishmaya, B'derech Nes. To win a war against an army which is 8 times larger is the B'derech Nes. And God will do this Nes for us if we're mismoisen nefesh for the Torah's values, the Torah's concepts, that this is the truth, not Hellenism. Hellenism is a limited truth, only applying to the physical universe. It does not represent the truth of reality itself, which the Torah represents. So Matasyahu went to war. And what happened? He won. Shocking. Matasyahu actually won. Which means that God did exactly what Matasyahu said would happen. The Banishim gave Kal Yisrael a Siyata D'Shmaya when it says in the Alanisim, Rabim Me'at Me'atim, that the many were given in the hands of the few. This was the true nace of Hanukkah. That's right. Because there's a real question that you have to answer about Hanukkah. What's that? The question is that the nace of Hanukkah is not mentioned, the nace of the candles, where 1 day's oil lasted for 8 days until they were able to replace the oil for the Beis HaMikdash to light the menorah. So therefore, 1 day of oil lasted 8 days, and this was a miracle, clearly a miracle, Shalei B'derech HaTeva, clearly. But why isn't this miracle mentioned in the Al Anisim prayer? The Al Anisim prayer, which we say in Shimon Esrei, is the prayer which Chazal created to talk about the miracle of Hanukkah. But the actual miracle of Hanukkah, which is not mentioned at all, and it doesn't make sense. The answer is, that's not the true miracle. The miracle of the lights was only given to Klal Yisrael because they were given another miracle before that. That's right. The true miracle of Hanukkah was the war. The Jews defeated an army 8 times the size, which had weapons and everything. Greece had the weapons of Alexander the Great, and they conquered the known world. And yet this army of tremendous military skill and 8 times the size of the Jews lost to the Jewish people, and this was an open miracle, and that's why Chazal put in the Ika miracle of Rabim Biyad Ma'atim. And because of the miracle of Rabim Ma'atim, all Chazal say about the candles is the Kavu Shmei, the Jews put in the oil in the menorah. They don't say anything about the miracle. Why? Because the Banishim said obviously something interesting. In other words, why did I give you the miracle of Rabim Biyad Miatam? Why did I allow you to defeat an army 8 times your size and with excellent military skills? Because you were Moisen Nefesh. You gave up your lives. Possibly you could have died all for my name. And therefore I'm doing the miracle of the defeat. But not only that, I'm going to restore one more time a true miracle in front of your eyes. You see it. And it was you were Zercha, not only to beat the Greeks in war, but you will be Zercha to see a real Nes Nigla, which has not appeared since before Hanukkah, before Purim. The last time there was a true Nes Nigla in Klal Yisrael was by the Maisa when the Persians controlled the Jews. Since then, there was no real Nes Nigla, except in a way certain nisim that were kind of happened to the Beis HaMikdash, but very few of them. So God said to them, I will let you see that the restoration of the Beis HaMikdash is not simply a new building, it also has the Shekhinah on it. That's right. I will show you, Klal Yisrael, that the Shekhinah will return from Greece back to Klal Yisrael. Right? Well, how did the Jews know that the Shekhinah would return to the second Beis HaMikdash, really? How did the Jews know that they would be worthy of the Shekhinah to come out of the exile of Greece and come back to them truly, in a certain sense? By the nace of Hanukkah, the nace of the candles. Not only, why? Because since the Jews were Moisen Nefesh for the Beis HaMikdash, the second Beis HaMikdash, and they weren't Moisen Nefesh before, they did tshuva in Persia by the story of Purim, right? With Mordechai and Esther, they did tshuva, but they didn't really see any miracles, so on and so forth. So how did the Jews know that the Shekhinah truly returned to the Jews? They saw that the Shekhinah truly returned to Beis HaMikdash in full force by the mace of the candles, because when they took the oil, and the oil was only could last 1 day, and yet that oil lasted. That wasn't salmon oil. You know, the Medrash says, where did that oil come from? So there's some kind of Medrash. I know I heard this from a big time of Chochem. He said that cask of oil, where did it come from? They looked in the Beis HaMikdash and they found there was none of the oil was left. It was all tamei. There was only one casket of oil that had the seal that it was tahor, and they took that casket of oil and they lit the candle of the menorah, and then that casket of oil lasted 8 days. Where did that casket come from? You know where it came from? From the time of Shimon HaTzadik. That's right. It was from the time of Shimon HaTzadik. That casket of oil was never used. From the time, hundreds of years before Shimon HaTzadik. And Shimon HaTzadik was the one who taught Alexander how to conquer the known universe. And what was the significance of Shimon HaTzadik? That the Rebbeinu Shem one day would bring down the Haskala of the Nun, first to apply to the physical universe and then to apply. And to show that he's right, this casket was the casket that lit the Beis HaMikdash with the menorah until they were able to produce oil. And it was a casket that indicated that someday the Shekhinah would come back, not in the form in which it is in the second Beis HaMikdash, but in the Priminius of the Shekhinah that returned to the Beis HaMikdash in the second temple was the Shekhinah that will be with us in the Yemos HaMashiach. And that is manifest in the light itself, that candle, that oil, I should say, the oil from that casket lasted for 8 days, which is impossible. And that was the light of that's the light that comes from the Shekhinah returning in its true form as it will appear in Yemos HaMashiach in the Priminius of the second Beis HaMikdash, not in the Chitzonius. There was no change in the Beis HaMikdash, in the avoid of the Beis HaMikdash, in the Chitzonius. But there was a change in the Priminius. The Rebbeinu was showing the Klal Yisrael in Hanukkah that you should know the Priminius of the Shekhinah that will exist in the time of the Yemos HaMashiach, when suddenly the whole world will be filled with the knowledge of God, is coming back to the second Beis HaMikdash. It will not manifest itself in Chitzonius, so you will not see it truly, but you will see it one more time in a Nes Nigla, in the oil that lasts for 8 days, from the oil that only exists for 1 day. That's the real meaning of the oil. It symbolizes that the Shekhinah, the Priminius of the Shekhinah, went out of Golus, the Golus of Greece, and back to the Beis HaMikdash, the second Beis HaMikdash, in its Priminius, because the menorah was instituted with that light that came from Shimon HaTzadik. And the real Priminiustic meaning is that, I don't know if anyone says this and so on, but it means the Rebbeinu was saying to Klal Yisrael, you haven't lost anything. Even though you have a second Beis HaMikdash, which is much diminished from the first Beis HaMikdash, and the possibility of open miracles and nevuah no longer exist, but don't think that this light has gone away. It has not gone away. It has only gone into exile, but it is going to return. It's going to return to the second Beis HaMikdash, the light of Nes Nigla, the light of nevuah, even higher than the light of nevuah, because the aspect of the Shekhinah, the Bechina of the Shekhinah, that it will exist in the Yemos HaMashiach, that is giving Greece its belief in the Haskala, that's giving them the ability to truly understand the mechanisms of the physical universe, will return to the Beis HaMikdash itself. And in the future, when the Yemos HaMashiach will be created, I will then return this complete power and make the Shekhinah from its Priminius to its Chitzonius. When it says in the Bracha, Hamarze Shekhinah Sol Etzion, the Bracha in Shemon Esrei, what does that mean? It says that means that God will return the Shekhinah, which is His presence, Letzion, to Zion. What is Zion? Zion is Yerushalayim, it's Eretz Yisrael, Ki Mitzion Te Torah. What's the difference between Torah that comes from Zion and Torah that comes, the Torah we have now? The Torah that we have now is the void of the Chitzonius of the Haskala. It's the void of the Nun Sharabina. It's the second Luchas. And it doesn't have the Haskala of what the Jews have to get. Right? It's in the Priminius. Where is that Haskala? It's in the Priminius of the Torah we have. Moshe Rabbeinu buried the Haskala of the Nun Sharabina in the Torah that we have now, which is given to us on Yom Kippur. So just like the Yeshin and the Yemos Mashiach will be returned, and then suddenly Yerushalayim will no longer be called Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim will be called Zion. Zion is the restoration of the Priminius of the Shekhinah into a chitzonistic form when the Mashiach comes back. And that's what we're waiting for. We are fundamentally waiting for the Mashiach to come. And what will the Mashiach come? What do we do? He will restore the knowledge of Haskala. And what's that knowledge? That's the knowledge of the Nun Sharabina, where we suddenly will understand the whole Chokhmah of the Nun Sharabina. And the Haskala of the Torah, it's Priminius. And we will suddenly understand it from the Torah that we have now. And how do we know that? How do we know that the Priminius will someday invade the Chitzonius? How do we know that the two Bechinas of the Or, Priminius and Chitzonius, will one day become one? How do we know that? Because of the story of Hanukkah. That's right. The story of Hanukkah was the inyan on a Priminiustic level of Hamarze Shechina Solitzion. God returned the Shechina from its golus, at least the Priminius of the Shechina, the Kal Yisrael, to the Beit HaMikdash, for the second Beit HaMikdash, which is a symbol to us that one day the Rebbeinu Shalom will do this to the whole world and bring the second Beit HaMikdash to become the third Beit HaMikdash, where suddenly all of Kal Yisrael would what? Will see the Shechina in its Priminius and in its Chitzonius. And this will be the Nun Sharabina, which will restore the Haskala, the Chokhmah of Ruchnis and Gashmi together to the Adam, the mankind, and from there he goes to Olam Haba. So what's the secret of Hanukkah? The secret of Hanukkah is not necessarily the oil itself that it burnt 8 days. The secret of Hanukkah is the fact that the Priminius of the Shekhinah, which exists in the Torah, is now in the Beit HaMikdash. And even though the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, there will someday come back the third Beit HaMikdash, which will contain the Shekhinah in Priminius and in Chitzonius, because it was returned in Priminius on the story of Hanukkah. That's what Hanukkah represents. The lights of Hanukkah, the 8 days of the lights of Hanukkah, which I once said before, represents the Madregas of Olam Haba. 8 represents the Madreg of Olam Haba. But the fact that we lighted 8 days represents the awe of Mashiach and the awe of Olam Haba that comes from Hanukkah. And the fact that the one day of light lasted for 8 days shows that it can only be because the Shekhinah came back. The Priminius of the Shekhinah. So it is the Haftach of the Rebbeinu Shalom to Matasyo and to Klal Yisrael. Just as you have fought for me now, and you have maintained the superiority of the Torah over Hellenism, which is devoid of the worship of God. It's the Nun Sharabina when it comes to the physical universe, but it absents the Nun Sharabina as opposed to the Ruchnistic world. But just like I will restore so therefore I am showing you that the light is coming back the last 8 days, because the Priminius of the Shekhinah, which is the energy of the Nun Sharabina, will one day come back. And it has come back. It's come back to the second Beit HaMikdash, but only in the Priminius. And that light is called Zion. The light of both Mashiach, the Nun Sharabini of the Mashiach, is called Zion. And Zion was born, when was it born? Zion was born on Hanukkah. That's right. It says, Hamarze Shechina Solitzion. The Rebbeinu Shalom will return the Shechina to Zion, which is Yerushalayim, with the Nun Sharabina. But when did that return? It sounds like it's going to happen. It's something which is going to happen in the future, right? No. It happened. It happened on Hanukkah. The story of Hanukkah is a symbol that the Shekhinah returned to Zion. Yerushalayim became Zion in its Priminius on Hanukkah. So therefore what we hope, and since we understand this is the true meaning of Hanukkah, it's the return of the Shekhinah to Zion. And Zion starts by Hanukkah. And because it starts by Hanukkah, because that's when the Nun finally come down to the world, first to physicality and then to spirituality. But Zion starts on Hanukkah. Therefore, Hanukkah is not simply what? It's not simply a holiday of the Rabbanan. And that's why the Rabbanim made it a holiday, because they saw that Hanukkah was special. There was something about Hanukkah which is awesome. Something about Hanukkah which happened, which never happened before. Because Hanukkah is that the Priminius of the Shina went out of Golus in a way, and it came back to the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, the beginning of the third Beis HaMikdash started on Hanukkah. It doesn't start when the third Beis HaMikdash is built. It started on Hanukkah. And to show Klal Yisrael that such a thing happened, the Bnei Shem therefore made a miracle of Nes Goloi, that the casket of oil for one day would last for 8 days, which was the nace that was engineered by Shimon HaTzadik to Alexander the Great. So therefore we have to understand the Priminius of Hanukkah, which I've never really seen written and so on. I never seen in a sefer that even said this. But the Hachzorah of the Shechina to Tzion, to the Madrega of Yishalayim as Tzion with the Nun Shai Rabbeinu, the Haskala of that was Hanukkah. And that's the Chag of Hanukkah. And my bracha is that just like it happened once before by Hanukkah, that somehow in this Hanukkah, it should be the Hanukkah with Mamash Yushalayim becomes Mamash Tzion, and the Priminius of the Shechina leaves Golus, or left Golus, and that should also happen to the Chesinius. And the Priminius and the Chesinius of the Shechina should unite, and Yushalayim should become Tzion. And this is the bracha of Hanukkah.
Amen. 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 Thank you. Excellent share. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, Shimon, you're saying it's really a precursor of Rabbi Akiva. So, what's the difference between the Tzion of Hanukkah and the Or of the Nun of Rabbi Akiva?
The Or of the Nun of Rabbi Akiva was actually the Nun. It was the true representation of Haskala. Haskala means the Nun as it applies to Gashmias and Ruchnias. And that was the Or of Rabbi Akiva. The Or that was sent down to the Greeks through Alexander the Great was only the Or of the Nun as it applies to Gashmias, but not Ruchnias. And that's why it presented a contradiction to Jews. Because suddenly it absented God. It focused on man and not God. And the Bnei Shem said, this is untrue. This is not the truth. What you're waiting for is the Nun in its full application to the Torah. And that will only be in the time of Rabbi Akiva. But, unfortunately, the Torah Gamalchus had to deal with the Golus of the Yom Mashiach, which is what I'm speaking about next time.
Yeah. But the Tzion part, the Tzion is the Or of the Nun, and Rabbi Akiva is also the Or of the Nun. What's the difference between the Tzion of Hanukkah and the Or of the Nun going into the Klippus? Is that the same?
Of course not. One is visible and one is not.
Meaning after
the Or of Rabbi
Akiva,
the Or of Rabbi Akiva was the nimshul of the Nun. And that was the nimshul of the Nun. And that was visible. It's just that he never spread it except to his Talmidim. Rabbi Akiva only taught his Talmidim. He never taught Klal Yisrael. And then Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai hid it in the mashal. So it was never revealed. But the Nun, as it came down to the Greeks, was the Nun as it applies only to Gashmias. So therefore, the Priminius of the Nun was still invisible. The Priminius of the Nun, as it applies to Ruchnias, was not visible. But the promise
was that there, they still needed
visible, right?
to put it into Nimshal.
Yes. You have to understand the essence of Hanukkah. The essence of Hanukkah is when it says Hamarze Eshchinos L'Tzion, that applies to Hanukkah in its Priminius. It doesn't apply to the Chthonius. It applies to the Priminius. And that happened on Hanukkah. So Hanukkah was the true beginning of the Yom Mashiach.
Wow. Even though Rabbi Akiva's time lived in the 4000, you're saying it really started 200 years before.
Of course, right now it started 200 years before.
So really, what Rabbi Akiva built is on the model of Hanukkah. But Rabbi Akiva's story really started on Hanukkah. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Because it started with Alexander. It started with Alexander the Great, which we see as part of the Hashgacha Pratis with Shimon HaTzadik. There's a reason why Shimon HaTzadik always appeared in Alexander's dream. There's a reason for that. And in fact, many Jews are named Alexander. You know what I mean? There's a name Alexander, and girls are called Alexandria. There's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. So the Yemos HaMashiach technically started in its Priminius with Greece. But the problem with Greece is they made an Avodah Zorah. They made their whole Avodah Zorah focused on man. You know, so it wasn't true Avodah Zorah, but it had that. But they did start the concept of science and technology and philosophy and logic. This is an emes. This is the Nun Sharei Bina, but only as it applies to the physicality of the universe. Mm-hmm. You know, and that's the difference between Hanukkah and the story of Akiva. They're connected. The Haskala is Hanukkah. The Haskala of the Tzion, which is the revelation of the Nun, of the Shekhinah, started on Hanukkah. It was supposed to end with Rabbi Akiva, right? But it didn't,
right?
Because of the sin of Klal Yisrael. So the whole Golus wanted the Klal Yisrael, and it was put off another 2,000 years.
That was Rajbi, that part, right? Is that Rajbi of Shimon? That last part was Rajbi changing it from Nimshal back to Marshall.
Right. He allowed it to survive. Right. So now you're beginning to see something which is you've never seen before. You're seeing the continuity. What I've said in this year was a continuity between Adam Rishon, the nations of the world, the Shvashim, then the concept of Torah, the Nun Sharei Bina, and the Golus of the Shina, and how this relates to the spirit of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not simply a story of the war between the Jews and the Greeks. Hanukkah is the beginning of the Yemos HaMashiach as it's supposed to happen. And it was supposed to start with Hanukkah, and it's supposed to end with Rabbi Akiva, but it couldn't because of Sinas Chinam. So therefore, the Yemos HaMashiach itself had to go into, the Gula itself had to go into Golus. So the Shekhinah had to go into Golus again. But the Haftarah is that the Yemos HaMashiach technically started by the Chag of Hanukkah. And that's why Chazal made it into a holiday. Why did Chazal make it into a Yontif? Why did Chazal make it into a holiday? Because that was the beginning of the Yemos HaMashiach. And Chazal recognized that. So therefore, they wanted to keep that new energy. And they made a holiday called Hanukkah, and they based it on the lights. Because what they said, so one day, this holiday will start the Yemos HaMashiach itself.
Can I ask you, the Nun going to the Greeks, wasn't that the idea of the Or going into the Klipos? It was the Greeks represented those Klipos, did they not?
In a certain sense, they represented Greek, but only because Klal Yisrael was not worthy of it. It was really supposed to start from Greece. Look, the intention of God was that it should start with Greece and then extend itself to the Haskala of Ruchnius. But that was not. But the Klal Yisrael was not worthy. I mean, at that time they were fighting.
Right. So you're saying a little different.
And they weren't worthy.
Classically, it's always been said, which is that usually that the Or goes into the Klipos because Klal Yisrael is not worthy, and that it has to be extracted. But you're saying that Rabbi Shalom had a different intention here, was that the Greeks should take it and spread it, and that should be a good thing, as opposed to it goes into the Klipos and then it has to be extracted through either the observance of mitzvahs or through peranios of some sort.
Why? Because in a certain sense, Klal Yisrael lost that schos. Why did they lose the schos? Because there were many Jews that became Hellenists. This was an Asoyan. God started the Nun Sharei Bina with the Greeks, but he hoped that the Jews would be able to do it. It was an Asoyan. The Jews suddenly had to reconcile this new light with the Torah, and many of them could not. Many of them believed in Hellenism. And so the Hashmonaim restored that emunah.
Right.
You see,
they were able to extract. So did they extract? So when you said that their Mesiras Nefesh extracted those sparks or those klipos from the klipos, and that would free the Nun So that Rabbi Akiva would then be able to deal with it later on?
Yes, in a certain sense, yes. The Hashmonoim and the whole war that they had succeeded in bringing the Shekhinah back to the Beis HaMikdash in its Priminius, so that the ore that came down to the Greeks would then spread through the world, and because the Jews lost it again because of their sinas chinam and their belief in the Chachmas HaGoyim L'chud, as if since it only applies to the physical universe, they lost the Geula again. So the Geula, the combination, the connection between the Panemius, the internal aspect, and the Chitzonius of the Nun, again had to go into Gullus. So we have to wait for the third Beis HaMikdash, which will then become the true Beis HaMikdash, when we will see the combination, the connection of the Nun as it applies to physical events and the Nun as it applies to Ruchnistic events. And then we will return to the Madrega of Haskala, because how do I know that Haskala is so important? How do I know that? How do I know? Why do I choose the word Haskala to represent the old Mashiach and the Madrega Adam L'Olam Haba? Why? I get it from the Pasuk. I get it from the Pasuk in the Navi, which says, do not think that, if you want to say that a person, a Chacham, should praise himself, don't say it.
What is it? Askil as Avdi Yaakov?
Yeah, it says it, because it says, let not a wise man glory in his wisdom. And let not a rich man glory in his wealth. And let not a mighty man glory in his strength. If you glory in this, how? So God says that you are masking me, you understand me. So God uses the term Haskell. He doesn't say Yodea, say Yodea me, that you know me. He doesn't use that term. Or that you understand me. He doesn't use the word Bina. What term does he use? Haskell. And it says also by the Mashiach, in Yeshaya, Hine Yaskel Avdi. When the Mashiach starts to become the Mashiach, what verb is used? When it says the Mashiach will suddenly have access to his wisdom, which is the Nun. How does it describe it in Yeshaya, in Nun Beis? It says, behold, my servant, the Mashiach, will become wise, Haskell, but it used the word Haskala, because Haskala refers to the Nun as it applies to the physical universe, and the Nun as it applies to the spiritual universe. And it says the word Haskell as it applies to Mashiach. So that's why I use the word. The Madrega that mankind has to achieve, which Adam was supposed to get to, is to acquire the Nun. And then he would have become the Mashiach from David, and that would have started Zichuch, and then finally Olam Haba. But he failed. But that's why I use the word Haskala to refer to the Madrega of Adam Arishan as it's supposed to exist. So I think we all understand this clearly.
Could you clarify what happens when a person, as a Lassai, gets into his mind the science, which is the physical Nun, together with the Mashal, which is the Nun of the Spheres, and he's able to bridge them together? How does the world become Zuchach when that happens? That knowledge, how does that knowledge change the Bria?
If I could describe that, I would have to have...
You were touching on it. I didn't want to disturb you. You were touching on it in the beginning of the share.
No, that's not the... Look, you have to be satisfied with what you have. Right now, you understand something about Hanukkah that you have never understood before. You know what? The purpose of the share is not to Megala the Nun or to explain the Nun, which I don't know myself. So what it looks like, what that Nun looks like when physical reality events and spiritual reality events suddenly merge and the two combine. But I tell you one thing that will happen. At least scientists have been looking for the unified field theory, which was the ability to understand all the forces of the universe as one single force. They now understand it as at least four forces, separate forces. Electricity and magnetism, electromagnetism, gravity, the weak force and the strong force, which I'm not going to explain. They're trying to find out one force which covers them all, and they don't know this. They have no idea what it is. Einstein was never able to figure it out, although he tried for the rest of his life after general relativity. So when the Mashiach comes, he will suddenly understand the one force which governs the entire universe. He will answer that question. So minimally, the Mashiach will be able to answer the question that scientists have not been able to figure out for 100 years since the development of quantum theory. Quantum theory was developed in the 1920s. Relativity theory was also developed about 1920. Since that time, scientists have never been able to answer that question. The one who will finally answer that question, how all of science connects into one theory that explains everything, is the Mashiach. And that's the Nun Sharabina. That we know at least. Okay?
Wow. See, the number 4 is not just a random number,
dreidel,
right?
You spin your dreidel, and if it lands on Nun, you'll be in the money.
Okay.
Amen.
We should all take that advice.
Is the four Yesoidis, the 4 letters of the Shem Havaya, to have it down to that? That's pretty big.
Well, okay, look, whatever, the Nun will be revealed at that time. Okay, thank you very much. This is the Shir on the Chanukah. It's a Shir that I think says something which you've never really heard before, and we should be zocher to this Hanukkah. This Hanukkah should be the time when the Priminius starts to become the Chatzonius. This Hanukkah should be the time of Hamalza Ashchinosoi Letzion. Yerushalayim should become Tzion with the addition of the Priminius and the addition of the Chatzonius. And the Shina should leave Golos completely.